Hi, I'm Benjamin Payne. At the K-12 Education Office at Hillsdale College, we support school founding groups and their efforts to start classical schools across the country. Finding the right leader is one of the first and most important steps to building a successful school. While we do consider experience in education, we seek candidates who exhibit unwavering personal integrity, honesty, courage, and servant-hearted leadership. Perhaps that's you. If you're looking to engage in fulfilling, impactful, and challenging work protecting our nation's future and building up the next generation of virtuous citizens, we'd love to hear from you. I'm looking for strong school leaders right now. Learn more about how you can make a difference at hillsdale.edu/leader. hillsdale.edu/LEADER. That's hillsdale.edu/leader.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scot Bertram.
Thanks for listening. The Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast is part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. You also can find more information on topics and ideas discussed on this show at our website, k12.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by Ian Nugent. He is assistant principal at Atlanta Classical Academy in Georgia. Ian, thanks so much for joining us.
It's good to be here. Thanks, Scott.
Conversation today about the theme, to be a student. Before we begin, tell us a little about your role at Atlanta Classical Academy, the duties and responsibilities of an assistant principal.
Yeah, so I am the disciplinarian. That's the majority of my role. I guess in some ways it's not the heart of my role. My role covers a lot of things related to all student life, developing students in their character. And so all of our social events, student government, our house system. I also work really closely with our RTI, our counseling department, supporting students who need extra support in whatever area that is. So I'm the heavy, but I'm also kind of there for the students who are in need most of help.
This discussion that you've started here, to be a student, there are three parts of a student that you describe. What are they, first of all, and how did you come to define it in that way?
Yeah, so when Hillsdale initially pitched it to me to give a talk, it was teaching students how to be students. And I don't like repeating words in a sentence. So I said, can I change that? They said, just take it wherever you want. And I was just reflecting basically on the last 10 years of teaching in the school and thinking about the different categories that we often talk about educating our students in. And of course, with our schools, right, virtue is kind of the foundation of everything. And then habits it's kind of this Aristotelian word that we now kind of use to describe something we don't like talking about, like skills. But they're these essential things that students need to be able to do and to have in their repertoire to actually engage meaningfully with our work. And then posture is the third. And it is important to sit up straight, unlike what I'm doing right now. But it's more about the orientation of the student in their mind and heart toward the education. And so basically it was just talking about how do you try to inculcate, how do you try to teach, how do you try to get students to really think in those terms and to actually start responding in those ways toward the education.
Yeah, let's discuss that. How can a school order itself where the end of teaching and inculcating virtue in these students?
Yeah. Well, I had a professor in college, Dr. Peter Lawler, who used to joke that the only thing he got negative marks on in his end of year reviews by students was that he couldn't inculcate virtue, right? Because it's impossible. Right? It's something that has to be chosen by the individual, right? No, but what I said about kind of virtue is just it needs to be kind of pervasive in your schools. It needs to be on the walls. It needs to be, in the hallways. It needs to be talked about at ceremonies. It needs to be part of the instruction. It needs to be the thing that you center your disciplinary conversations around. But in doing that, that's kind of like an obvious first step. If it's not just foregrounded, that's a problem. But I think a lot of schools do that. The thing where I think a lot of schools, and in ACA was in the same boat just until we started really thinking seriously about it, is having a way of talking about them that is very specific to virtues generally and like what a virtuous life is, but then having very specific ways, a language, so to speak, about talking about each individual virtue that your school has. So that's going to vary between schools. But we started getting very particular about how do we want our students to think about the virtue of courage? What does it mean to be humble, right? What does it mean to be a servant, right? To have a heart of service. And so we just have described a vocabulary to ourselves that we then, communicate to students. And it really comes down to a kind of an ancient kind of task that we were given of naming things, right? Name the things you want people to care about and your students to care about, and then be able to describe them to them, right? So that they actually can know them, right? Because it's not something that students will intuit unless they're taught, right?
You might be in a unique situation or position to answer this, considering your role as assistant principal. But students spend only a portion of the day at Atlanta Classical or at school, and then only a portion of the year. What happens to virtue away from the school building, and how do you bridge that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually often talk to teachers about it almost in the exact opposite terms in some way, saying, I don't think about summer break or anything. I say, we have these students right with us for 8 hours of, more than 8 hours often of the day. And it's the majority of their waking hours, right? And so we are in a lot of ways responsible, right? For their upbringing, for their rearing, for their education in a way that their parents, right, are really entrusting us for, right? We're not going to replace their parents, and that's not what we want. That's not our goal. But it does, when you start to count the hours over, a week, a month, a school year, 12 years, right, or 13 years if you're K through 12, and you're with us for those 13 years, that's an immense amount of time. So, and then we try to think about it in those terms, so that we are really taking seriously our job in that way. But part of how we also talk about virtue with the students is as a manner of life, right? This isn't something that we just arbitrarily, because we're kind of nerdy and we like the Greeks, we decided we're going to have these things on our walls and we're going to make a school about that. And it's just kind of an arbitrary imposition on them. It's actually, this is something that we tell them is good, not just for its own sake. It's good for them as people, right? There's something that we believe is true about human nature that actually requires virtue to really feel fulfilled and feel like you're having a happy and meaningful life. And it's also a way of living in relation to other people, right? And so that isn't something that you can just have at school when teachers are watching and then go home and forget, right? This is how you treat your brothers and your mother and your father and your friends. And so that's how we try to talk about it, because it is easy for students to think oh, this is kind of a cheat code, right? If I do these things, I get rewarded. And if I do them, very, carefully, not to draw attention to myself or ask for praise, but to do it just in a way that they're expecting me to, I can give the teachers what they want. I can give Mr. Nugent what he wants right here. And we don't want them to think about it in those terms. We don't want them to think about it as a kind of vending machine, right? We also don't want them to think about it as something that is, that is purely for a kind of utilitarian benefit. It seems like everybody who does these things and orders themselves well ends up with better grades and better colleges and then better jobs, right? It's easy to fall into that, right? Especially as a student who's just thinking kind of about themselves a lot. And so we are trying to orient their thoughts and their gaze, so to speak, away from themselves and toward others.
The 3 parts of a student virtue, part number 1, the habits is 2. Why are the habits of students so crucial to forming them into effective learners and then eventually good people?
Yeah, so this is I started off my talk with what I thought was going to be a little bit of a controversial statement, just rile people up a little bit. Because when I started in 2014 with ACA, there was this kind of attitude that yes, habits are important, right? Kids need to know how to learn how to read and write, and to read analytically and to write and annotate in a way their books and to know the nuts and bolts of things. But our content is so compelling, it's so rich that more or less they will kind of learn it through osmosis, right? The exposure will do that. And obviously that was just kind of misguided, right? Or it presumed too much of the content and of students, right? And so over the last 10 years, we have just gone through a series of learning experiences of what it actually means to teach students what the exact habits they should have are. And the through line through all those efforts is that you just have to get insanely granular, right? You have to presume complete ignorance about that they know that they ought to write their homework in their planners, right? Or that they need to keep things separated in their binders, or they need to kind of put dates on things to make sure that there's an order to them. It's that level, right? And so that's something we need to pay attention to, but it's also something that is hard to get students to really feel pumped up about, right? And it's not something teachers want to do either. So you have to really tell yourself as a teacher, and as a leader, you have to tell your teachers, like, we think this is important enough that we're going to dedicate class time to it, right? We're going to teach the students, but then we have to follow up, and we have to have a plan for making sure that someone is responsible for checking their binders, for checking their folders, for checking to see whether they have any missed assignments. And so we really bit the bullet on that in the last couple of years and just doubled down to say, we're going to make this happen, and we're going to make this part of what we teach our students for the sake of their learning. And the way that I'm encouraging people to think about it is that it's a really small thing, and it can feel just trivial, but it actually is in some way a small little microcosm of what it just means to order yourself generally, right? And as our students matriculate and they get to 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, they're starting to see that the burden on them to order their lives, order themselves in the next few years as things become really crucial is increasingly heavy, right? And the world is just so chaotic, and there's so many things pulling at their attention and at their desire and telling them where they should go, where they should dedicate their life, their work, right, their attention. The question of how do I order myself, or what am I to do, right? Who am I to do it with, right? And how am I confident that it's going to mean something and I'm going to be happy? That's actually part of it, right? And so as they get older, right, that is the conversation we're having. These things may seem, trivial, but every one of us had to, get to this place today. We had to have our shoes on, right? We had to come with the notes we have prepared for this podcast, right? There's tiny little things that we have to do, and that when you're an adult and you've done it well for a long time, you don't think about anymore. But as a student who hasn't had a model or hasn't been taught explicitly, it's really important that those things be taught.
Some of these small things, is it necessary or advisable to quite literally explain the why? Like you mentioned, putting a date on a paper. Okay, so are you going to tell the students, this seems small, but we're doing this because of this reason? Is that helpful in allowing those students to develop those habits?
Absolutely, yes. One of our school counselor, who is also our executive functioning kind of leader for the upper school, at least, she starts off her kind of crash course with new students who enter the upper school, telling them that exact thing, which is, hey, this is a lot of front-loaded work, right? To learn these things that you maybe should have learned in your previous schools, but you weren't taught or something. But it is going to save you time. It is going to save you stress. It's going to make you feel more confident in approaching things that otherwise would seem very daunting, right? And so, when we're telling you every date needs to be on this each paper, so that you know exactly which materials are going to be covered on this quiz or exam, you don't want to get to that quiz or exam or the studying portion and not know, what am I supposed to study here? Which one of these handouts, right? Like we're actually giving you something that will save you like anxiety and stress, and it will just give you a sense of, I don't have to keep all this in my head. I can kind of free my mind to focus on the most important things because I've done these little things that give order to the day and to all of my materials and to all the things I need to think about. So yeah, that is really what makes it kind of bearable and compelling to students, is knowing that, this is a good way for me to live. Yeah.
Talking with Ian Nugent, assistant principal at Atlanta Classical Academy, to be a student, and these three parts of a student: virtue, habits, and now posture. What do you mean by posture of a student, and what does it look like to cultivate that which you want? Yeah.
So I told the folks yesterday when I presented just that 4 words: openness to the truth, was a kind of orientation and a phrase that changed my life. It was spoken to me over and over by Dr. Peter Lawler, who was my mentor in college, and I took every one of his classes I could, and then some directed studies. But I came into college, and I just told this story to the folks yesterday, that thinking that maybe I didn't know everything, but I knew kind of the one thing that explained everything, right? And it was, and I didn't actually know anything, which was the truth, but I had such confidence that there was basically no way we could enter into any kind of conversation or debate or argument with me really having the feeling like, oh, you might persuade me, right? I was so dogmatic. And 1 hour in his class, it just shattered my worldview and made me realize he was the most brilliant man I ever knew, and he had this perfect humility and openness to anything. He was also very devout, right? It wasn't that he didn't believe in anything, but he could hold the world kind of open, right, in his mind, and he could entertain ideas. And he knew he didn't have to adopt them. He wasn't afraid of them. And he was, perfectly undogmatic in that way. And I just wanted to be that way. But I also then realized I have to rebuild everything that I think I know about religion, about politics, about society, about myself, right, and what I believe about my relationship to my friends and my family and to my neighbors or to my country. I had to rebuild myself, and it was a crisis. And I don't necessarily want students to have that crisis, right? They need to have something of it, but hopefully not as far along as I did. But part of what it is that I think I told the story just because I think it's easy for students to attend our schools and then to graduate and think, I've had a great education, which they have, and I've read a ton of books, so many more than like a normal public school and even private schools, right? I can write really well. I've had a thesis defense, and to kind of be puffed up by that knowledge, right? And to actually be then closed off to the truth, right? Or they can come in to our schools for the exact reason they know that everything they already believe about the world might be confirmed by these really intellectual, smart people that are being taught by doctors and poets and former professors, right, that are brilliant people, and they think, right, and I've confirmed everything. And I don't think we ever want our students to get to a point where they have that kind of implicit or explicit arrogance to think that I know enough to not know and learn anymore. And so cultivating a posture of humility. At first, the kind of three words I used was humility, kind of realizing that in the sum total of all human knowledge, right, what any one person knows is a drop in the bucket, right? That should just make us feel small. And the second is wonder, right? And from humility should come wonder. It's easy for that kind of crushing humility, kind of realizing how little you know and how little you are, to kind of be paralyzing. But that we should, narrate for students how they ought to respond with wonder that now everything is open to them, right? Once you realize you know nothing, you actually can explore with a genuine earnestness and a desire to actually know things and to discover truth, right? So now anything, right, is open to your mind if you have the will to pursue it. And so from that place of wonder, also then telling them very clearly that there's going to be continued unease, right? Humility, wonder, and unease. It's just not the truth that the acquisition of truth is a happy thing all the time, right? I mean, Solomon said, he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. And there's real truth to that. And students experience that in our classrooms, right? Sure. There are parts of our human, condition that are dark and are heartbreaking, right? Are really tragic. And it's easy to try to want to kind of, look away, right? Or to disown them. But we need to kind of do both things at once, to encourage them to look at them and to kind of settle with that unease, but also then to know how to respond to it. So those three things are kind of what I try to cultivate in students.
What does it look like practically to narrate the story of students' education to them and for them?
Yeah. So this is where I closed with my talk, which is just thinking about the ways that students tell themselves a story about their own education, or their parents will, tell them why they're at this school, because it's this and that. Right? Maybe it's because they believe good things and virtuous things and they really like that. Maybe it's because we have the highest test scores, right, or something. And so this is basically the best prep for college you could have. And then others are, more negative, right? Like this place is, too legalistic or militaristic, right? They don't have a sense of humor, or they, whatever parents want it, like it's too strict, whatever it is. It's too demanding. You're expecting too much. And then there's the students telling them each other their story, right? And so we've seen this over 10 years, right? I've especially teaching middle school in the years that I did, where we have this kind of phenomena where lots of students in the early years would leave after 8th grade because their parents had been applying them to private schools the whole time. And the moment they got in, they left. They wanted a high school at a very prestigious, a private school that would send a message to colleges. students are going to have their experience narrated, right? It's just by whoever is telling it to them most consistently. And so for one example of this, how it looks practically, to respond to this just kind of circle of negativity and criticism and in the middle school years, it also only develops in 8th grade really at our school because of the thinking about high school, but also it's just 7th graders are just still on the edge of kind of real innocence and wholesomeness, and there becomes a kind of bitter, the ironic detachment that happens in 8th grade. What we started doing was having what we call our 8th grade meetings. And so we have 66 students in 8th grade. And so the middle school team, led by our dean, will create a spreadsheet to schedule meetings with every student and their parents. And in those meetings and beforehand, the middle school team has created a Google Doc for every single student, which has this kind of formal report structure. It's very elegant looking. And at the top, they have given a short epithet to that student, a kind of phrase that describes something true and really noble or beautiful or valuable to the school about who they are as a person, something that everyone notices in them as something just good that we love about them. And so they kind of get that epithet as kind of attached to their name as a kind of gift. And then every teacher who has taught them records just a paragraph of written reflections on memories with them, on attributes that they see as just being things they want to, admonish them to continue like embodying and pursuing, really funny anecdotes and also just kind of general encouragements. But by the end of it, it's about 2 pages or sometimes more of the teachers, the people who are spending the most time with them in their waking hours, putting them all down on paper and telling them, this is everything that you've meant to us, and this is why we love you, and this is our gift to you as you leave 8th grade. And you sit down in a room with 2 or 3 teachers, depending on who can get there with their schedule. I'm there sometimes, our assistant, our upper school principal is there sometimes, and then the parents and the student. And to see the impact of that being said over a student to their parents, right? For the parents, it's so encouraging and hopefully validating, right, of their work as parents.
Right.
And for teachers, it's just so cathartic to just be able to say, because we have, if you're a middle school teacher, you have 132 students because you're teaching 7th and 8th grade. And that's
sure.
And so in the normal kind of crush of the day, you just don't have the space to say those things meaningfully to every single student, maybe a couple here and there. And you are generally trying to kind of be encouraging, but to have that really set aside time is just become a kind of sacred tradition at ACA. And it is just, people are in tears, and kids and parents, and it's a beautiful thing. And it reminds people just that this is the truth of your education, right? This is what you've meant to us here, and this is what you've taken from us, right? And we want you to take this, from us still, right? And then also, give yourself back to us in the way you have these last 3 years, 2 years, whatever it's been. So.
Ian Nugent is assistant principal at Atlanta Classical Academy in Georgia. We talk about his discussion to be a student. Ian, thank you so much for joining us here on the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Scott.
I'm Scot Bertram. We invite you to like us on Facebook. Search for Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education. You also can follow us on Instagram at Hillsdale_K12. Hillsdale_K12 on Instagram. Thank you for listening to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.